Welcome to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. This is Jay. In this episode, we welcome Dani Manibat to the podcast. Dani Manibat is an organizer in the National Democratic Movement in the Philippines, and this article was written for the journal Material. Recently, we hosted another conversation with J. Moufawad-Paul on settler ideology on our YouTube channel as well. A little bit about Material from their website. Material's editorial framework is guided by a Maoist perspective, and so this journal is a platform for contending schools of thought with non-antagonistic contradictions. For revolutionary communist thought, the kind of thinking that agrees capitalism cannot be reformed, that actual revolutionary work is required, and that collaboration with any kind of liberal or conservative thinking is exactly that, collaboration. End quote. Dani's essay, The Marxist Framework and Attitude on Social Investigation and Class Analysis, is available for free online, and I've linked it in the show notes. I have also included a link to Foreign Languages Press, which is a great press for Marxist work, particularly from a Maoist perspective, but also including many classics of Marxism and Marxism-Leninism. A little note from the article description: this essay is an ongoing product of discussions and conferences among Filipino Marxist and National Democratic youth organizers as we attempt to deepen our understanding of social investigation and class analysis, or SICA, work. It is in this light that not only is there a necessity to underline the importance of SICA work for the Filipino youth, but also to give some pointers on what to look for, what to watch out for, as well as have theoretical discussions on social classes, end quote. I'll add that this conversation and the essay work really well together. You can get more of the theory behind SICA and how one might think about the process perhaps from the essay itself, whereas here we have a wider ranging conversation on the practice and on some examples of how these things might look in the day-to-day. There is a portion of the conversation where Dani references a graphic. I will note that section when we get there. I have uploaded a video from that section of the interview so people can see that graphic that Dani is describing as he is talking about that. And I will link that in the show notes as well. As always, to support our work, the best way to do so is to become a patron of the show. You can do so for as little as $1 a month at patreon.com/millennialsarekillingcapitalism. Dani, welcome to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. It's great to be in conversation with you. You know, we're here to talk about an essay that you wrote for Material, which is a journal that is put out by Foreign Languages Press that, you know, is now, just as we're talking, had just put out their second issue now. So it's been around for, I guess, about 6 months or so now. So to start, do you want to just introduce yourself a little bit to our audience and share a bit about the context from which you came to write this essay about social investigation, class analysis, which is what we're going to be talking about primarily today?
All right. Me personally, Dani, I'm just a Filipino youth researcher, but I think what's more interesting is that, yes, I am situated in the Philippine movement, and I am a National Democrat. So I do fight for national liberation against forms of imperialism, monopoly capitalism, to win democratic rights for the broad masses. However, it isn't really a surprise to anyone who had, I guess, an introduction to the National Democratic movement currently in the Philippines, that it is really also largely influenced by Marxism, particularly Leninism and Mao Zedong's thought. And one of the things that they really emphasize there is social investigation and class analysis. I guess Leninists would also hear the phrase concrete analysis of concrete conditions, but generally kind of almost the same. I think the context of writing it could be interesting for some who are looking into the struggle here in the Philippines. Let's give this some background. So one of the really interesting things about the National Democratic Movement is that even if the politics of it is not necessarily new, and even its Marxist content is not also particularly new, it was the only movement by its time that actually definitively tried to situate class relations and class struggles going throughout Philippine history, thus justifying its way forward rather than, as something that I think we'll probably talk about later, invoking ideological terms or rather common revolutionary phrases. And that work would be a bunch of works. I guess most notable would be Philippine Society and Revolution. But as early as 1977, there have been people within and without the movement who've always tried to question whether that analysis of the Philippines being a semi-colonial, semi-feudal country with the following class relations are still valid. And I think I did discuss it in the text that it did have political ramifications. So the context of that now is that it's been 50 plus years since Philippine Society and Revolution came out. And while there have been efforts throughout the decades from the 70s onwards to update the analysis of Philippine mode of production, etc., one thing that I think needs to be, or not just me, but what I think Filipino activists are also realizing, is that that kind of work shouldn't just be limited to macro analysis of social production, but also all the way to the micro level of organizing. So essentially, it's really a push for the comrades and mass activists alike, of all persuasions, to really get down to the concrete conditions and relearn in practice and through investigation. Why are we even fighting, and why has this struggle lasted for more than 50 years? Does it still have basis to grow and to expand or to even win victory? And, to prove it not only as a matter of belief, but to prove it in the investigation process, that there really is basis to overcome all the difficulties that go with organizing struggle against capital and other reactionary forms of social relations. So I guess that's what it is. So I guess, yeah, pretty much.
I appreciate that. Yeah. Looking forward to getting into that kind of discussion, because I think part of what you're laying out too, is something that I think a lot of folks feel. I mean, the United States are by no means our struggles as advanced or as many, as many forces and people kind of involved in them on a kind of percentage basis of the population as in the Philippines. But certainly we have a lot of, kind of doctrine or dogma or just older interpretations of socialist analysis that were one at a different time period, but also often written at a time period where the Marxist or the communist movement was much larger too, right? And so, it's I think part of what I hear you talking about, right, is and what you point to in the essay is that, we can't just inherit these older interpretations uncritically. We actually have to go out and do the work of analysis and investigation, to analyze our own times and to determine the course of action. Would you say that's correct?
Yeah, generally.
Yeah. All right. So in broad terms, could you just talk a little bit about what is social investigation and class analysis, and how does one begin to engage in such a process?
I guess really it goes back to the notion that from a Marxist perspective, which is heavily biased towards I wouldn't say it's scientific, but let's remove possible misinterpretations of that as a positivist science. But this notion that the world is material and it's constantly in flux. So it's really given that everything is in flux, the best that we should be doing as revolutionaries is to understand the general direction of that flux, of that motion in society. So it's to capture what's happening right now, understanding what's leading to it and what it could possibly be. That's how I really appreciate social investigation and class analysis. It's applying that kind of rigor and method to daily and regular meetings and daily activist life in order for people to understand and see for themselves social change. And I guess, yeah, essentially that's what it is. I guess that's why I said that people can sometimes call it concrete analysis of concrete conditions, but essentially it's to analyze the twists and turns in the general development of social forces. And of course, I guess, from a Marxist standpoint, that really means primarily, but it's not limited to, analysis of the class struggle. That's why I guess it's social investigation and class analysis. To answer the how does one begin to engage such a process, it's part of daily life. It's just the usual problem. It's like you live as an activist or just a normal person, you encounter life, you make something out of it. So you do have some analysis. The greatest problem that I've encountered, not just on like a personal level, but if you go back to various failed movements or failed organizations, there is really this trap of not doing the work of doing investigation properly and regularly, thus leading to one-sidedness or subjectivism or being myopic in one's view or being, tunnel vision. Because really, if you really ask someone how does one do SICA or social investigation and class analysis, it's really you gather data or sense data or people's thoughts, and then you try to derive what is the essence of the phenomena. And usually you do that, especially as an activist, in a collective setting. So to me, the irony being, it looks like the essay is pretty theoretical, but in practice, the theory is really simply done as like meetings, assessments. And that is actually sometimes the big question. Like, are the assemblies assembling? Are people actually assessing? Because like we will, like to cite an example with the old movement in the first actual Communist Party in the Philippines in 1930, until 1967, they've never actually done any work on investigating Philippine society concretely by the data and by the book, and as well as how their organization went through all of it. So if you actually studied it and stopped looking at the decisions made during World War II, etc., as mere, because the leader was this or that, and you start looking at it from the perspective that they had this sense data or they had little data on this, and they never really bothered to like really scratch their heads on that kind of data, you kind of understand the downfalls that would lead to several massacres, disorganization, and the like. And personally, I've seen that in my own personal experience when I am in an organization and we don't assess in time or don't do assessment work in time or check in, even just checking in on the disposition of members. That's one form of doing social investigation and class analysis, where you actually know how the masses, your members, feel, how they talk, how they dress. And on the macro scale, you understand the patterns and the struggles that are going on. And you're not just purely relying on what you learned from books, nor are you simply just relying on what you or others have experienced, but you go through the entire scientific method of really analyzing and synthesizing the various data. So it shouldn't feel like it's rocket science to understand how to do it. To me, in my personal experience, and I guess you could see it in history, the difficulty comes in regularly doing it and trying to make that regularity better and more efficient and consistent, of like really keeping in check how the development of things are happening, I guess. Yeah, that's how you see it.
Yeah, appreciate that. And I mean, I think one of the things I picked up on just in what you said just now, but also reading the piece, right, is that a lot of what you're thinking about too is not necessarily, I mean, quantitative data is part of it, right? Numbers and statistics and, things like this. But you're also talking about qualitative data or even I guess, the subjective data too, right? Like, like conversations and things like this, right? And relationships, right? And this will probably connect into this a little bit. This is probably just a quick question, but you use a term, praxilological entanglement, in this essay. So can you share a little bit about what you meant by this and why it's important to Sika?
I think that a lot of confusion or dogmatism could really emerge if one begins to interpret Marxist theory from a standpoint of say categories like base, superstructure, classes, etc., and taking these categories as if they are absolute and unhistorical. And really, right, like if you go back to how Marx developed theoretically historical materialism, right, and even his and Lenin's critique of Hegel, it really goes back to this notion that how history develops is through activity. Or I guess you could say I just use the word praxis, or essentially the synthesis of theory and practice. And you could see, instead of looking at things from a rigid notion of, this phenomena is in the base, this phenomena is in the superstructure, or like, I'm going to go on a rabbit hole here, or if you will allow me, right? So like just notions of
please go down any rabbit holes you want to, please.
The interesting debates to get the Soviet leader Stalin to address whether language is in the base or superstructure. Like these kinds of debates that seem too abstract. I think all of these can be really resolved had we just thought of the whole thing as there's really just human activity that are more entangled to others. It was something that I'll keep arguing was when we go into class analysis, is that it's not really helpful to look at categories like peasantry or proletariat or whatnot as an abstract category in the same way that people, I guess, would say a Catholic versus a Protestant, where it's like a set of beliefs or a set of rituals. Well, when it's not. It's a historical development of various human activities that are interconnected, some more than others. So that's why I really tried to get away with in the same unfinished thing that Marx did, where he went, but classes is a profession, and then he died. Right? Like no one really knows that. If it's not profession, what is it? People say it's the relations in production, but at the end of the day, what reinforces and negates in the everyday that relationship is how you act and the context of which how you can act. So I really, really struggle to belabor that point on praxeological entanglement, that you have to look at how these categories and these actions and these thoughts even are all situated in a certain space-time, given certain agents, given certain capacities, and given certain materials. You could actually literally look at it as like physics. It's almost like Newtonian physics, right? Where you're looking at bodies and their interactions given a certain condition. And that is what determines what it is. Because even if you look at, I'm going to go on a rabbit hole, I'm sorry, man. But you look at physics, right? No one's actually really seen some of the subatomic quantum particles. You only perceive them by how they interact. So it's in the motion, it's in the activity that one knows that one is. So in that sense, you will only know categories like class. You'll only understand society if you know how the different interactions are working. That's really what it is. So that's the guiding theory or concept that I'd use towards understanding class relations, rather than trying to make up my own schema of class, whatever. You just go back to activity to praxis and how all of these praxis are more entangled to others. It's something I think I'd go down later, this notion of like, of course, like your class is really going to be heavily dependent on what you own in terms of the means of production, because quite literally that already signifies how much of your capacity to do anything, to do activity, is already affected by it. So it just follows by how it affects appropriation and how people can coerce you to certain types of activity or certain types of labor, rather than seeing these categories as they either, I think it'll be discussed later, where some people will reject that classes exist. Possibly, I guess, my assumption is because there are people who also, you absolutize it, or like they look at class as a dogmatic category rather than a historical thing. I mean, you even hear that among even a self-professed communist would say that you're not being proletariat enough, or like what does that mean? It's like, because some proletariats there are a lot of proletariats who do heinous stuff, right? So you can't really ascribe a set of morals or ethics to that, but there is basis for it, and you can only unpack that if you go back to the basis and the actual activity being done. So because that's how I look at praxeological entanglement. I'd probably write on that later on, like trying to explain historical materialism from that lens, so that you don't go into really weird positions like asking whether language is in the base or the superstructure, because that can get really confusing. Because if you say it's neither, then are you allowing human activity outside the base and superstructure, or right? It gets complicated.
Yeah, that's great. I look forward to reading you write about that more, think about that more. So let's talk a little bit. You've kind of alluded to some of it, but let's, give some examples or talk about this a little bit more about some of the pitfalls of failing to engage in such analysis, meaning social investigation and class analysis, relying on slogans or dogma or, you say isms in the text, previous analyses performed by Marxists, or also, one of the things that we often get stuck doing, right, is utilizing academic scholarship to understand given situations, because often folks, feel they don't have the resources, right, or it's easier to pick up an academic book to understand something. So, yeah, talk about some of the pitfalls of these various ways of doing or not doing what should be done.
All right. I think when I talk about this notion of the reliance of slogans or isms, it's one thing. I'm not even talking here about whether the idea, the line being presented is correct or not. The assumption actually here is the line is correct. For example, let's talk about mental health, or like bad mental health. We could say that bad mental health in the Philippines is generally caused by crisis brought on by privatization and neoliberalism in this country, right? So that line is correct. The statement is correct. However, if you don't do the social investigation of getting into the particulars of certain communities, certain sectors, or certain individuals who get certain types of mental health problems, then you wouldn't really be able to solve the problem, because you just generally have a correct notion that yes, neoliberalism is kind of part of why this is all a whole thing right now. Like, you could see it. You could actually show it with a graph and correlate how much mental health incidents can be noted vis-a-vis how it gets in neoliberal policies get introduced to political economy. It's correct, but if you don't get into the nitty-gritty, or like the notion of to be radical is to get to the root or to the essence of knowing both what is generally and particularly true about the matter, then you wouldn't be able to solve anything. Because I've had experiences where people would use this, or give blanket slogans or general solutions which are fundamentally correct, but they either fail to address the issue or they fail to actually get the point across. So one issue I mentioned was mental health. Like, you could tell a comrade with bad mental health, oh, the reason why you're having this because neoliberalism, probably family history, or coping mechanisms, etc., without actually knowing their particular history. And nothing gets fixed if you only get satisfied with the general. But on the same time, you would get cases from a propaganda perspective where at least a few years back, before this whole West Philippine Sea, China, US, Japan situation came, sometimes it's so difficult for people and activists to get their point across that imperialism is still a very much irrelevant point of discussion. It is one of the roots for monopoly capitalism and imperialism is still pretty much the root cause of all social ills right now in this current situation. And people, I've heard numerous stories of some people responding to that they don't get it. Or you and I'm pretty sure like other comrades in other countries have experienced this, where the theory does match with reality, but when you actually talk to the person, you've not done enough work in understanding their experiences, of how those experiences could be related to the actual phenomenon of imperialism, right? Because if you really think about it, unless your country is being outwardly colonized or drafting people into a war, it's pretty hard to understand imperialism, much less to even comprehend that imperialism is equivalent to monopoly capital. Because some people will understand capitalism as the source of, of evil. I wouldn't say, let's not be moralist. To be scientific, like social crisis comes from a lot of capitalist crises, but people would not be able to see why that is relevant to stopping the war in Palestine, stop the war in Ukraine, even if they're from the Philippines or even if they're in another country, without seeing that. And you can't just tell people to read books. You can't just, it's one way to say, you just join our educational discussion and you will be enlightened. Yes, generally, that's the painstaking way of doing it. But if you only given 5 minutes with this person, there are more effective ways. Had you known what this person's problems are, what this community's preoccupation mentally and physically is, So that's how I look at the isms part, or using general slogans. It's not about whether what we're talking about is right or wrong. We're already presuming that we're saying something right. But we are talking about how it's not enough to just know the thing in theory or in general, but to actually know how their particular is and how that particularity is very much still tied to the generality that we've already known.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I kind of want to ask a follow-up, but one of the things that you made me think, so yes, I just want to say that I think that we have that problem a lot, in the spaces that I'm in, and, even through programs like this one, right? And I agree with you, right, in terms of like imperialism, monopoly capitalism being, in my view, that it is sort of, the primary contradiction, right, of a lot of the ills all over the world. And I think, what we've seen with like Palestine and everything, like kind of just reaffirms this for a lot of us. But the failure also to be able to connect that to people based on their everyday experience, that really resonated. Recently, at this social center that I work at, we had a conversation on housing, and it was a tenant-based organizing conversation. It was about a couple of tenants who had been actually shot by these private contractors that do evictions in Philadelphia, right? Police don't even do evictions. They're done by these private contractors who are hired directly by judges and are often family members or relatives of judges, right? And so there was a whole organizing conversation about this, but like a person walked in off the street, right? And their main point that they wanted to get across was that basically, we needed more police to get the homeless people off the street. And, obviously, it's a room full of, leftists, Marxists, anarchists, other folks, right? And, they don't agree with this perspective, right? Of course, they don't agree that more policing is the solution to homelessness and, people being ravaged by drugs, basically, right? By fentanyl and things like this.
Yeah, right.
And, but all that they could do was sort of preach to themselves about it. You know what I mean? Because they all agreed with their own perspective, which I agree with as well, right? Which is that, policing is not the solution to a lack of housing or to drug addiction among houseless people. But they weren't able to actually make any connection with that individual at all, or even attempt to, kind of try to understand anything about that person's social relations. And I get that that's difficult to do sometimes in a meeting like that, right? Where somebody comes in and makes a comment. But I think it speaks also to a general disconnect that exists often between, kind of everyday Black and brown working class Philadelphians, right? And a lot of the organizers, right, who come from more of often they're students or grad students or kind of petty bourgeois in nonprofit spaces. And I don't say that to demean them, because I think they're all trying to do the best work that they can. But again, there's this disconnect between the analyses that they've already developed and just an ability to engage and understand even where do the perspectives come from. Like part of what this gentleman said that came in off the street was like, in my day, when drugs were ravaging our community, we all got put in jail, right? And so now that it's ravaging mostly white people, they should have the same treatment. And it's interesting in some respect also because that's not totally true, right? What he said. There's a lot of Black people who are addicted to fentanyl. It's not just white folks, but that speaks to a certain narrative that's out there within the media as well.
Right.
But anyway, it was just it's a small example of, I think, kind of what you're talking about, of there's not enough investigation, I guess, into trying to understand where that gentleman was coming from, and as a broad thing, because there's a lot of people who would reflect that same talking point,
right.
among working class Black Philadelphians, right? And so even engaging enough to kind of understand it and try to think about, how do I work on unraveling this question, addressing the things that they're thinking about and caring about, rather than just my own analysis of the situation, not connected to anything that they're thinking about or caring about, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I actually, if you'll permit me, I actually have an interesting example of how to get past that. And in a general sense, when I look back at it, it's really notable during election year. So 2019, 2022, you will go out and you will go campaign for some progressive politician, or specifically use the elections to raise the discourse on a progressive radical politics that, can still fit within legal means, whatever. And you will encounter people who will agree with you on all forms of that, like all the lines of the political line, but support the candidate who is your political enemy. And that is really interesting, because you will have these people who support the reactionary regime, but they support you in all your political lines, not just in theory, mind you, but in practice. I've had experience of this where a barangay, how do you say kagawad? It's like a local official who outwardly had support for the Marcos regime and the Duterte regime candidacy in 2022 elections, but he supported us all the way. Why? Because we were with him in fighting against a demolition in their community. And the dude gave us like spaces in, even if as they were being demolished, to hold meetings, hold discussions. He even attended the rally. I've seen in a couple of rallies. But they supported the regime. And then that kind of cognitive dissonance is really interesting, right? Because like, how do you reconcile this? And as you were sharing your point, because I realized there are a lot of people who are like that. Like, you ride a taxi and then they will say that, oh, this whole country is going to shambles, and they get most of it right. And then they don't blame the role of the figurehead of the state as pushing that. When they say, oh, but he's being surrounded by business oligarchs, which is not wrong. But you can't overthrow the oligarchs politically. I mean, you can, right? From a real revolution. But like, that's why there's like activism. And like, it's not making sense for some reason for some of these people. And you can't just say that, I don't want to say that it's simply out of political immaturity or simple petty bourgeois arrogance of activists. I think that the thing that made it able for us for some of us rather, to experience those cognitive dissonances and really just get gains is not just the investigation part, but it's having clear political goals outside of specific issues. So if the political program and the political goals are set, I remember this, that it doesn't matter if the person understands and grasps the line on a shallow level, but as long as they're on the line, as long as they're on the line and you keep going at them, they'll get it eventually. And you'll understand that even if technically their initial misconception in the theory was, it's muddled and incorrect, but in the process of those somewhat, informational compromises, you actually get them to participate more in the struggle and get more chances to have discourse with them and discuss with them. And then they're able to see it for themselves, or how they were disinformed, rather, in most cases, right? Or like how their view of their personal histories has been distorted. And you can see that a lot from like people from like I guess Gen X up, where it's almost as if they've been gaslit by state propaganda to see their hardships as mere, oh, do be that and we survived, right? It's like a survivor's guilt almost. But then instead of trying to be right in theory or in information for the sake of it, because the political objectives are set to strengthen the organization and to win certain issues and etc., without sacrificing crucial theoretical principles, you're able to make, some sort of concession or like a pause to certain debates to enable them to catch up to the reality of the struggle, to the present, which then allows them to see for themselves, right? It's so funny in a sense, again, a dialectical joke where you somewhat seem to begin from an untruth, but in the process of it, you realize through investigating not for the people, but with the people who have been disinformed, you begin to see the actual reality that both you and the disinformed were not able to see at first. And in the entire process, you get enlightened. Really. Right. Really a curious case.
No, I appreciate that. And I think that's right. Yeah. And I appreciate too the point on, it's not just, of course, many of these folks actually are not really petty bourgeois, right? Even in terms of when I was talking about like the activists and the organizers, they're really not, right? And in some cases, I think it's also part of the problem of nonprofits, right? Because as you're talking about it too, the importance of an overall political perspective line revolutionary organization, etc., right? That often is missing, right? And so they're just engaged in activism often around the specific issue, even if they may have themselves a bigger horizon, right? They often have a view of, in the United States, often we use this term abolition, but they often have a kind of revolutionary vision of a different society, at least, that they see themselves as working towards, right? But it's often then pushed into the politics of, a small local nonprofit or whatever and its goals, which,
Right.
are usually more limited. Yeah. All right. So let's get to the social investigation part of it a little bit more. Can you talk a little bit more? You talk about methodologies in the texts of social investigation. How do you see this as being done, and what advice do you give cadre who are looking to do this type of work?
Mm.
I know you've talked about this a little bit already, but yeah.
Yeah. In the text, I gave an answer that's on the liminality of general, but also quite technical, where I used certain terms of getting quantitative and qualitative data. But for me, in essence, I don't think that it's not a question of cadres getting into this kind of work. In my experience, I see it as cadres doing the work in whatever form it comes in. So there are really people who are really good at organizing people or certain groups of people. Like, say, some people are good at organizing, grandmothers or ordinary people, and they have a tangible grasp of how the people actually are from a qualitative and both a quantitative basis, like how many people are affected by this issue, etc., etc. But those same people, again, owing from the entire division of mental and manual labor, have grown in an education system where they have personalized their hatred for mathematics. And you get that. So there are really also people who are really good at crunching numbers. And I dare say that it's not a question of, is there one specific method? There is none. There's a general guideline to it. And the point is, the more of us do the work of getting rich number and quality of data and subjecting it towards collective analysis, that's how the SICA is actually done. It's the collective part. Because everybody has a capacity to rationalize and understand and make an analysis of a situation. It's I always talk to some friends and colleagues and comrades who wonder, why is it in the Philippines or the global south, there's seemingly some lack of, theoretical culture like the Greeks or whatever. And I tell them, yeah, it's just that we, the common people, do not care about what some old dead white dudes had said for 2,000 years using their terminology. But if you just walk by the street and you at 12 a.m. and see someone in monoblock chairs outside drinking, you're bound to hear someone talk about how they're philosophizing their life's experience. So it's not a question of, say, skill, because that can be learned depending on the purpose. So if you're part of a team that's into researching hard data for policy critique, hard data for tit for tat with certain politicians and policies or that kind of analysis, it will require certain kinds of study technique. But I also argue that people who are good at organizing grandmothers and organizing, common people, that is a technique. Both of them do require the practice of getting into it. And the only advantage is that once they submit all of that data towards collective discussion and so simply do it regularly, that's when the SICA becomes really fruitful. In general, I've kind of stipulated some things in the work on how to study things when basically it's just an application of dialectical materialism where you look at the interconnection of things, right? and you look at that as from a scientific standpoint, where everything is a quantity of a certain quality. And from understanding that, you make educated guesses on how things develop, and you make measurable targets, actionable targets. These are rocket science things. They're pretty senior high school thought, smart objectives, right? Specific, measurable, attainable, and all that stuff. And which only goes to show that Marxist thought, or the whole thing behind it, is not something that was, came from the heavens of Marx and Lenin and whatnot. It is really the science of the people. It belongs to them. It comes in different forms. And the question is how all of this collective knowledge you've had of trying to gather data and analyzing it is put into collective practice. Because to me, that's why if you did notice, right, I did talk about methodology, but it's really minimal compared to the rest of the discussion, which is not just an editorial decision consulted with material, but it's quite there even in the first draft, that it's not about the method that I'm trying to talk about here. It's to really appreciate the role that social investigation has in everything that we're doing, and to make people do it so that in the process of doing it, they find their methods, they refine their methods, what works for them as an individual or what works for them as a collective. Because some people, they don't carry notebooks when they go out into the field, right, and talk to the masses. But then when they come to a meeting, they know exactly what this person's problem was, and how it could be a basis to get someone recruited or whatnot. But then there are other people who are good with the books. I've belabored the point, but yeah, essentially that's that. In terms of method, it's really getting enough data, understanding these things as quantities of certain qualities, seeing their interconnections with other phenomena, or I guess in a societal lens, praxis, the praxeological entanglement rather, and making trajectories and actionable steps to seize that development from what you have initially, to transform it to a more progressive and revolutionary, strong position, whether to increase organization, strengthen it, bolster it, put the enemy on the defensive, etc., etc. Yeah.
I appreciate that. I have often encountered some folks, not usually obviously from the dialectical materialist perspective or scientific socialism, who, have this critique of the idea of science, right? I'm trying to kind of use their arguments, right? Because I appreciate...
I get it.
I appreciate what you're saying about also how we think about science, right? And I think you would have a good answer to this. Is just part of why I wanted to bring it up as you were talking, because I think a lot of times they think of it in terms of like a hard science, right? Or, their argument is sort of like that Marxism, hasn't achieved, right, what it sets out to do. And so that, other sciences would say, well, that disproves your theory or whatever. So how do you approach science, right, as you're talking about it and thinking about it?
Right. That's really interesting. It's like one of the main theoretical gripes I have and my comrades have with that is really the positivist, like mechanical view of science as what we have it in academia, where we argue rather, because like it's a lot of a term we use among us is Mariomania, like you're being manic over the details without seeing the whole. So definitely that's not the science that Marx is talking about, because he's looking at totality and its interconnections. And second is, you've got a bunch of studies and philosophers and thinkers and actual natural scientists who either theorize without sufficient empirical data, or just gather a bunch of empirical data without questioning the assumptions they have for the data they collected. And lastly, because it's all in the academe, and the academe is really not, I guess in neoliberalism, you could really say the academe is the diploma mill and just a points mill, right? So it's not really there for practice. It's not really there for actual changing the world. But then how would, as a Marxist would argue, you won't know how the apple really tastes like if you don't eat it. You won't know what society is like if you don't change it. So if you're already stuck in that kind of context, I really do side with this critique that science has kind of been distorted to benefit the bourgeois hegemony. And hence, I kind of argue that there should be a re-examination. You know, you will find this funny in a Hegelian context, right? Where we kind of have to revive what I call the magical mode of science, where it doesn't matter, right? Right? It's really funny because like people who study magic say magic is about knowing the quote-unquote proper name of things. They're just so trapped in the idealisms of it all, where they attribute it to spirits. But what magic had that science is not always consistently being done is that magic was being done to do stuff, like to fix something. And if you really go back to like folk traditions in various cultures around the world, the magic, the religion, or that fusion of proto-knowledge, all of that was like to cure diseases, right? To make structures, buildings. It's all really practical. It wasn't to make a degree. It wasn't to get cash money. You know, it's all really practical. So to me, I do actually embrace a certain level of methodological anarchy, if you permit that kind of term, as long as it gets the job done. I guess that's why some people say that Mao has a little bit of anarchy to his method, where he just allows stuff to happen, because the whole thing will really just, it will sort itself through the contradictions that take place. But yeah, I do think that we shouldn't call Marxism the same way that we shouldn't call it science as if it's a mechanical science, because it's really beyond that. That's precisely the kind of thing that why I think Marxism really did emerge from a guy like Hegel, right? Who really tried to look at the totality of things, but just, you know, he began with thought without history. But to me, that's what it is. It's to look at the totality of things and not to be so hung up on the method, but in the dialectical irony is that you still need to get good. So my general advice, again, like just to highlight that point, is that the real general advice may not seem like rocket science, but for an ordinary cadre or a cadre or an activist, it's really hard, which is all activists, no matter what persuasion, I fully believe this, you must study harder and also integrate and do mass work deeper. Because it is through those deep integrations you find the real essence of things. And it's really amusing to me in the sense that I've read anarchists who criticize some failed anarchist organizations, or even like their assessment of the Spanish Civil War. And when I read it, of course, they wouldn't use the jargons or like the terms, but almost renders like a Maoist text. So I fully believe, right, how Lenin says that facts are stubborn things. If you really subject yourself in the process of finding out the truth, the more you will actually realize the fundamental ideological weaknesses of various persuasions and organizations. And you'll find yourself to the more correct ones. So that is actually the challenge. I don't want to be the one imposing on any comrade or anyone who really wants to change society that this is what it is. I'll give a general guide, but the whole thing is you must act and study harder. You know, the thing is, like in the Philippines, we're trying to correct this notion of some comrades being too complacent in studying theory to improve practice, and vice versa, too timid to draw and create new theory out of their practices. Because that's what the real content of Marxism is. It's not to just, memorize the phrases. It's really a science that must keep on developing. And it can only develop by eating the apple of the world, so to speak, right? To really burn the whole old world and start something new, to go through the failures of it. So, yeah, if anything, I don't know if we'll go through it, but it could be a thing, right? Where there's some videos I've seen where there is this sort of like delusion, anarchist pipeline towards Maoism. And I find that quite interesting because I myself, I began as a National Democrat, sure, but then I was really into Deleuze before I realized all of this makes more sense with Mao, practically. But yeah, so that's how I'd see it, man.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, be a wizard. Yeah, I appreciate that. And I would say, I mean, funnily enough, this comrade I'm thinking of, I would argue that he engages more scientifically, right, than a lot of Marxist-Leninists in our contexts, because he actually is heavily engaged in practice, is heavily engaged in constant conversation with the people that he's seeking to organize or organize with, and is really grappling with the real contradictions that they face and the local contradictions with the political and local elite, nonprofit elite, and all of these things, right? And so there is, I would argue there's a science to the way that he's approaching it, right? But, he would reject that, maybe that term or that framing, but recognize probably through his own thinking something like experimentation, right? Or,
right.
So anyways, it's an interesting, I think that there's like you say, a lot of, it's really pretty close. And in some ways it's a difference just between, in some cases, I think it's just what people want to call it or call themselves, right?
Right.
But yeah. So again, another thing you take some time in the texts that I do want to talk about some is how you actually do class analysis, how you analyze different factions or components within class to think about, you talk about this term class alignment within these factions as well. So can you talk a little bit about kind of what you're looking at in that section and how you analyze something like class alignment? And if you want to give like real life examples or experiences, that probably would help make it more real for people too.
All right. So again, I guess the thing is, the general argument when I was doing this whole class analysis was, it really stemmed concretely of it. It's like an anecdote by the dissatisfaction of certain people with the current presentation of Philippine class analysis. So most comrades, I think all comrades, sincere Philippine comrades who actually do the work and are engaged in the field, do understand that the Philippines is still a semi-feudal country exacerbated by monopoly capital and is not, some sort of backward capitalist country. However, it is also true that the number of peasantry, at least documented, of course, we could factor in how it's improperly documented by Philippine government statistics. But there is a level of population migration towards urban centers without these people being actual workers. So people begin to question whether, oh no, then the dominant population are no longer peasants. So they look at this pyramid-like structure, where it's like at the very bottom, you have 75% are peasantry. Oh, it's no longer 75. Does that mean that society has changed? The class relations have changed? And this is not something I realize that should be problematized by just Filipinos with the current updating of the data, but it's kind of how, it's a fundamental problem, I believe, with this common depiction of class, right? Where it's usually like this some sort of pyramid where people at the bottom, a lot of them, and then people at the top. When we look at society, it's more complex than that, right? Like, there are populations that intersect or like they merge into others. For example, you'd have people who are technically farmers, they're peasants, But if you look at their quality of life, they're more akin to like rural petty bourgeois. So where do you categorize that, right? It's like, are they put with the petty bourgeois or are they put with the peasants? How would you categorize, how would you visualize that? So I started to reinvestigate this. And with this notion of praxeological entanglement, right, you actually do get to the notion that what are humans first preoccupied with? It goes back to the basic tenets of historical materialism, which is production. And then you realize that, of course, we observe this, right, on all primitive communal societies. The difference, even if they had no class, precisely because they engaged their material conditions in a certain way, they develop certain ideas about themselves, the world, and as well as various practices. So now you imagine a situation where people become more diverse in the division of labor. So their engagement with material reality and their conception of it becomes different. Their value system becomes different. Their ideology becomes different, right? And you see now how classes emerge. That it's not simply a list of your profession or how much you earn, which is, how the government in the Philippines measures it, right? Salary brackets, it's more really akin to, first, how much and what kind of means of production do these people own, which does have a direct relationship or proportion to how much they're able to appropriate from social production. And then I guess the next one would be their participation in the actual production. And then another one that I would use is something people don't always look when looking at things from a synchronic level or from a general outlay of society. But if you look at things from a diachronic or like a historical, chronological level, you can actually see patterns of what kinds of preoccupations or classes are essentially going to become inessential as society develops. So with that, instead of looking at things from a us versus them narrative, where it's like, it's helpful from a propaganda standpoint, right? Like this notion of the 1% versus the 99%, because that's really real. Like that is observable that the 99% do have a basis to unite against the 1% or even the 0.05 or 0.075, right, of society. However, it is also historically observed that even if you do have a basis to unite, there's also a basis to betray each other and disunite. And we cannot simply blame that on just individual whims. And luckily enough, Marx was able to somewhat outline that. So in the main essay, I think what they used was some sort of table between property, non-property, the participants and non-participants. And then from the perspective of transition to socialism, those who have conditions to remain necessary under socialism and those who don't. So that was actually not the original visualization of that. So I'm not sure actually if this is going to make it easier because like the editors, I understand the point. It kind of looks confusing because the original one, I guess I'll share my screen.
It is at this point in the video where Dani shares his screen to talk about a graphic representation of class alignments and class articulations. I've included a link to that video in the show description.
It looks like, imagine having a circle, and then you divide it first along the lines of property. Any shape, and then you divide it in half. in terms of property. So you would have the initial table of property and non-property. I'll just screen share this, but so that you would have like a visual guide to this. But I'll explain it from an audio perspective so that I guess our listeners could get it.
Right.
So this is what it used to look like. So you would have from a line of ownership, the property and the non-property. So, and then if you add another line on participation, and then you add another line towards the essentiality or the historical necessity of these kinds of labor or positions in society, then you'd have a sort of strange figure where it looks like you've divided classes into sort of their alignments with others. So the more close they are to each other, based on the dividing lines put together, the more basis they have to link up with one another. So for example, on the basis of ownership, definitely you'd have the industrial proletariat, agricultural workers, farmhands, drivers for public transport. You'd have the industrial reserve army, and you'd even have the lumpen proletariat as a non-property class. Yes, but if you divide it based on participation, then the industrial reserve army, who aren't actually participating in, the main sources of produce in a society, as well as the lumpen proletariat, are split. So you could see how the industrial reserve army could be used because they're one step divorced from the industrial proletariat, agricultural workers, farmhands, etc. And if you even put the line of historical necessity, of course, no one will argue that drug pushers, and gang members are necessary in socialism. So even if they are non-property, but because they are not necessary for socialism or a more advanced society, neither do they participate directly in production. They are twice divorced from the industrial proletariat. And thus, you see the actual basis and the actual facts of the matter in which the lumpen proletariat are used to crush organized working class resistance. The same way as it is on the other side of the equation, where, of course, for the property, you would have most professionals, certain services sector members, middle peasantry, craftspeople, big state officials, and all these functionaries. But if you divide them again towards participation and how essential they are towards this kind of society, towards the next forms of society, you would also begin to see why there is actually a basis for big state and military officials and the big bourgeois functionaries to not really be in cahoots with most professionals and certain service sector members, because they're still divorced by one step, by when you divide them all the lines. And you can see exactly how, because they are on the opposite side of these people, are especially the big comprador and the big landlords and financial aristocrats, they're thrice removed from the industrial proletariat. It's almost like this is a graph of like class antagonism, right? Where it's so directly against each other, even from a visual perspective. You already see the basis for this to be truly class antagonists. So hopefully with that kind of discussion, or even the published version is already helpful from the table's perspective, you could actually see how we've had experiences of that, where you'd go to a community. This is funny, like we have two schools who would organize one community, and then another school that organized another community on different sides of the track, on the railroad track. Now, what they had organized were gangs. One was like a male-dominated gang. Another one was like a female youth-dominated gang. So they're both youth. They're both a mix out of school youth and in-school youth. And they had gang-like capabilities. And even if they were, they technically had the same issues against demolitions and all that, they're both technically not the most, technically not propertied in the way the bourgeois are, right? But because of their notions of like how their praxis, their life is existing in those quite lumpenic activities, there have been incidents where they met up, technically part of the same organization of youth, but because they didn't like each other, they had a riot. Yeah. So you see it play out live, right? Where it's not romantic at all, where it's like, oh, all the people got up one day and suddenly got mad at capitalism. In the same way that there's basis to unite, the differences in production and everything is also giving us a basis to disunite and even flip on each other. And you see that with Marx's example, for example, how he called the National Guard, but he looked at the French military, but it's not the official French military, as lumpens who subjugated the workers who rebelled or incited rebellion in 1848. However, in another study, it would be realized that they're actually not lumpen proletariats, but they came from sectors of the peasantry, but not exactly, the same as agricultural workers. So there really is, you could see it. And even how, so it doesn't have to be just the lumpens. You see this in daily life where there is basis to disunite and unite all over it. And it's not just topics on, like, say, gender or race, just on a pure class perspective, or rather from a pure praxeological entanglement perspective, just because of how different we all are preoccupied with various activities and concepts of the world are different. There's so much basis also as well to disunite, even if there is basis to align. So I guess, if you have, questions on that, I'd elaborate on that more, but that's how I pretty much see it.
Oh, right on. Thank you for that. I'll put a video up probably of just that screen sharing portion, right? So that I can include it alongside so people can actually see that. That's great. So I didn't ask a question on this in the questions I sent you, but so how does that differ from class articulation?
Class articulation. Class articulation for me, I think I got this from how Joshua Moufawad-Paul also quoted the original dude who got it, who was an analytical Marxist. But I'm not trying to use it from an analytical sense where I'm just imposing a semantic term. There's class articulation, guys. It really just stems from class being different versions of social praxeological entanglement. So if you look at class as not a solid thing, right, an abstract category floating as a box boxing all of us, but as variously affiliated or covalent praxis or activities and conditions for those activities to bond together, you would realize not only the basis for alignment and disalignment, but that certain activity, owing to the fact that certain people do those activities more, that activity gains, what people call a class mark, or that activity gains an articulation or is expressed and understood and distributed in the viewpoint of that class. So it's just a way for us to understand concretely without resorting to dogmatism Marxist notion that dominant ideas are the ideas of the ruling class, etc. It's not just the ideas. It's literally, to me, how we could have these uncomfortable discussions regarding, for example, art, right? Because there would be self-professed Marxists on both sides of different classes who would assert certain definitions for art based on their various experience of it. But then you would also realize that because the bourgeois, the remnants of the handicrafts classes of Europe and the elite have had more time to contemplate and to keep doing art compared to the proletariat, the art would really look bougie as hell. Like it would really be conceptualized in that form. And hence why whenever I teach art, I always tell students that, art is really a recent invention and that it will and you should pray for the conditions where you no longer consider that practice in that light. So you would also see that when you look at other discourses like, say, religion, spirituality, race, gender, etc., where you understand it, where current discourses on gender, they've been preoccupied with certain people who've had the liberty to contemplate, experience it, etc. That's why even if there's so many people who technically are not straight or hetero, subscribe to heteronormativity, there's still contradictions going among them. You still have LGBT people subscribing to like precisely the politics that create the convictions for their discrimination, precisely because, there is a struggle in these discourses or let's just abandon that term discourse. It's not about the words, it's the praxis, right? These praxis, the praxis of gender, right, is being articulated more dominantly by certain classes. So there are definitely activities which don't relate to more fundamental praxis like production that get articulated in a class way. So that's where we say there's art, the gender, race, spirituality, right? These things don't absolutely matter to what your class position will be. It's not like all Black people, especially outside the United States, are going to be a certain class. They're not. But because of being in this class society, that their experience becomes, subjected to and thus articulated, contemplated about, and reinforced through class means. That is how you explain why, yes, every struggle is a particularity, that you can't just say that class struggle is the only struggle. But living in a class society, all other praxis are articulated by certain contradictory classes. Hence, affirming the notion that even if it's not just class, in the end, the primary is class. But again, in another dialectical turn, it goes back to the point we made a while ago, where to just say that just because you're right in saying class is primary, it doesn't mean that you just generally blanket all of the struggles under class without understanding the particularities of these class-articulated praxis. So it just goes back in circles. And it really takes, I believe, not just skill, but so that it doesn't come up as gatekeeping, but really you will understand these things the more you subject yourself in solving these problems in actual activist work. I think we can all agree on this, right? That it's really that. It's not like we're trying to gatekeep this. It comes like it's a martial art almost, where no one can really make you get good unless you yourself get beaten up and actually do the work and subject yourself. And it becomes so intuitive because you memorize the patterns and you've seen how to solve these positions. So yeah, that's how I understand class articulation or class articulated praxis.
Yeah, I appreciate that a lot. And I think even the conversation you mentioned about Black people, like in the United States, I mean, like one of the things that connects to what you just talked about, right, is like the Black celebrities and the Black folks that exist within the media, within politics, within, sports,
Right.
Culture, right? Like that there's a very different, even for those of them that may not be making that much money off of it, or have that much ownership over the means of production, right? To think about class, right? Often what is promoted, right, almost always is this aspiration towards a kind of bourgeois, lifestyle and so on. And so again, like the majority, again, to use the 99, right? 99% of Black people within the United States, right, are living either a proletariat or lumpen proletariat or, this kind of lifestyle, right? Or this kind of class relations, but yet what's represented to them is not that. Right. And it's similar to the point you were making about LGBT people, I think, even in terms of, again, like, yeah, you said, who has the time and the resources, right, to engage in and is promoted, is given access to within the art world. It's often the means of distribution, right, the means of promotion, of their work on a kind of mass scale.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That really reminds me of like the recent Marxism Today video on Kendrick Lamar, Drake this. So, yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean,
Absolutely.
they're both owned by these massive Zionist imperial, organizations are making money hand over fist off of this beef. And
right.
It's kind of people have been talking about, like, there's this white artist, Macklemore, right, who actually put out a song that was pretty good, right? That was like in solidarity with Palestine and students that were organizing stuff like this. And he actually made the point at some point in the song of the reason I can put this song out is because I'm not on a mainstream label. I don't have a corporate enterprise that's filtering and saying, oh no, don't do that,
right.
And the people around me, so
I like Kendrick, but
I do too. Yeah.
Right? You understand my point. Like,
yeah,
he's from the culture, but
yeah.
Again, the industry is a class articulated industry. So there really is no way of getting out of it. It's like, there's a good book on that, like 9.5 Thesis on Art and Class. It really succinctly captures it. Like, that's why I always have a distinction between popular and mass culture. Because the masses have their own culture and it can interact with pop culture. But pop culture is this really weird thing where its primary figureheads are petty bourgeois with workers as like their staff. But the one who makes the executive decisions must be palatable to the bourgeois to make a buck. So it really will, right? It really will produce in times of crises, like, material that people can relate to, because the people articulating these products are petty bourgeois. They do experience the hells of capitalism, but because they don't experience it the way the proletariat does, and more primarily because it's funded and produced by the bourgeoisie, right? That's why it becomes like that, or all the resolutions to these films are just so asinine, for lack of better terms, like such a good premise. Like, you'd have films like Snowpiercer, Parasite, the Korean one, The Platform, The Menu, where it's like Triangle of Sadness, right? These films, like, there's been a slew of films recently, right, in like the late 2010s onwards, where it's really, they're really talking about class. For once, right? Like, after the 90s, this is kind of interesting that they're talking about class. They're talking about class structure and like the violence of it. But damn, the resolution of all of it is just individual based, ahistorical, as if class struggle is happening in a bubble. And that's really the most destructive part of it from an artistic standpoint. Whereas, like, most of these situations, they're presented as very isolated. Like, no one tells you how the hell the platform happened, or like what happens after Snowpiercer, right? Like, they seem so isolated without you realizing this happening the world over, right? And so, because everything is happening in a vacuum, when it gets resolved, they've already extracted the agitational affect out of you. And it is, as you know, as other sort of leftist thinkers would say, the revolution has been performed for you, right? Or, right, exactly. And I get their point. I really like the point where, yes, we like Kendrick, but it's really almost like a way of like seeing how people make money out of Che Guevara shirts.
Right.
It's exactly. It's exactly that.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So you write about class rejectionism, and yeah, this is a common thing. I myself and Josh, co-host of this podcast, like, we interview a lot of folks within the U.S., and a lot of them are leftists of some sort, right? And many of them are in the academia where this is really promoted, I would say.
Yes.
And there's a lot of versions of this. And, you look at some that are kind of in the text are kind of, these academic ones, but also ones that, happen within organizations, right? That
Right.
call themselves, socialist or communist or something along those lines, right? So yeah, talk about some of the versions of this. I mean, I also say, like, I think there's certain times I've been, guilty of this, right? And so it's something that I'm always trying to think about and combat, and think about ways to, again, like, focus on class, but also in a way that is capable of articulating with all of these other, as we were just talking about, race, gender, etc., and the ways that the way the class articulates within these different, lines of difference, quote unquote.
Right. Class rejectionism. I honestly think that class rejectionism is the only natural response to the failures of a dogmatized Marxism, or a dogmatized Marxism-Leninism, particularly, where you start to think of categories like base and superstructure, class, as if they were actual abstract structures, right? Like, it's really curious because, like, look at it, right? You look at the base superstructure, definitely you see a building metaphor going on, right? And if you look back at Marx, when he first mentioned these notions of, like, this is the base of society and then this is the superstructure, it doesn't mean it as if these categories or class are categories which are like, this absolutely exists. He's more talking about it from a more trying to get you to understand it literary kind of way. In the same way he would say, like, how people notice, if you read Capital, almost reads like a Gothic novel, right? Where it's like a lot of vampire, werewolf references and all that. And like commodity fetishism, specters, it's not like he actually believes that, it's a specter. Which is why it's so funny, because it's really just various forms of idealism to me that makes sense. Like, I understand why it happens. It's like, take, for example, like, on the notion of specters, which, Derrida, right? He would turn into his whole ontology thing of, like, things recurring, or, like, even not Marxist. Let's talk Nietzsche, right? Eternal recurrence, like, things just keep repeating, or like Hegel. But the thing with all of that is, what you are doing is, essentially, when you reject class existing or being a focal point of politics, because you hate or criticize the dogma, which is correct to criticize the dogmatism, but to target class in and of itself, you are essentially attacking activity. You're attacking praxis. So how then do you explain history, right? You explain things through eternal recurrences. It looks like ghosts and spirits, or in more modern, neo-Marxist, post-Marxist, like Ernesto Laclau, Chantal Mouffe, all of these, they're so obsessed with discourse or language, right? But language here is not treated materially, I would argue. They're not treating language historically. They're treating language as carriers of consciousness, of ideas, which is why it's a flip, essentially, back to idealism, right? To say that there are no classes, to assert other categories without putting the class question back into it, is really tantamount to a notion that everything is just about, discourses and, all sorts of very ahistorical, but, perceived categories. Like, as someone who did read Deleuze, desire, right? Like, you've turned desire into an ahistorical category, which becomes the basis of, like, social crisis, to put it in a very simplified way. But it's not that, right? It's like, it would be akin to, like, saying, like, hunger is the basis for social crisis. And because everyone is always going to be hungry, then social crisis will always happen. That's why it really makes sense why Deleuze's argument on desire and how desire is, quote unquote, deterritorialized, reterritorialized, its flow, the desiring flow and production, that he would argue that capitalism is a flow of desire that has existed since time immemorial, but was just suppressed by primitive communal societies and, becomes fully out there, in the present day, which is definitely not the most Marxist take at all. Not to argue it from a Marxist standpoint, but from a historical standpoint, you could clearly see capitalism emerged in specific conditions of specific places, right, and specific times. And what are they? They weren't floating ideas. They were actual activities that happened given the interplay of various feudal colonial nations. Otherwise, like, you just flip it. Like, what's so different about the desiring flow in China, which disabled it from developing capitalism earlier than the West, given that it developed paper money and banking and, printing presses and, gunpowder much earlier, right? And then on the flip side, really, you would see that this notion of class rejectionism, right? You get it. It's the same fault Hegel had, where he realized that ideas really do have an effect on activity. But then he made ideas the primary thing rather than the activity. But then an interesting take from, I believe, Ilyenkov was that this isn't because he was just some, good old Christian who thought that, its absolute idea is God, It's actually a fundamental mistake we all create as humans. And you could observe this in Marxist points in Capital to belabor the point that profit, surplus value, does not come from money, right? You just replace the whole money commodity, money prime formula for capital and turn it into thinking activity, thinking prime. And then you would realize that is the same Hegelian mistake, where they made ideas the primary instead of actual concrete activity or conditions. And just as people mistake the money, which is really just abstract value in some sort of commodity, as the primary transaction that produces surplus value, which really comes as a fault how history develops and how we perceive transactions. Of course, you cannot get access to making capital, or you cannot, live without the money. And just as the same as why Descartes, in his cancelling of all arguments for existence, realizes the only reason he can prove he exists is because he thinks. But common sense will also tell you the only reason he can think is because he exists. And that is I wouldn't say fundamental, but it's a very common problem of thinking about things, to flip things on their head which is why I believe that class rejectionism is really just this desire of people who were frustrated with what happened in the 60s and the 70s with Marxism, right? And they really want to recapture that magic, and they're trying to look for alternatives. When the problem is that it's not trying to create the new by destroying everything. It's really finding out what was, separating what was distorted and what was actually rational in the basics, essentially. And you'll find that it's also dialectic, where, remember, like even what I was telling you a while ago, that ironically, I think the way to push the revolutionary science and science forward is not to fixate on the positivist science, but to return to that magical mode, as I said, right? That very praxis-oriented doing of science, not the alchemical ivory tower, the way of doing science. And so that is such a very, I don't know, it's quite a petty bourgeois mistake or a petty bourgeois tendency that the translation, the good translation or the good desire to get out of the situation is, instead of actually trying to change the situation, you think that it's a problem of theory. Right? I see you're smiling. Like, you get it, right?
No, I totally get it. Yeah.
Right? And it's exactly the same point that Hegel flipped ideas with activity, Descartes flipped existence with thinking, and people mistake activity and class for the class articulated things.
Yeah.
And that's why precisely that the bourgeois, especially in one of the most sophisticated, monopoly capitalist state fascist countries, the US, why they would specifically target class articulated praxis as the site of their chosen struggle. Precisely because anything goes there. Like, you can have an avenue of struggle in class articulated praxis like gender, race, art, representation, etc. But at the end of the day, if you don't seize the means of production to actually question the way the activity is done, then all of this is just articulation. You haven't changed the way it can be articulated. That is my general critique of it, I guess.
I appreciate that a lot. All right, so I'm going to ask one more question, and we can kind of wrap up, because I realize I've had you on here for quite a while now, but this has been a great conversation.
Yeah, I've had fun too.
So this is a quote from your piece I wanted to read out and then ask you to talk about it a little bit. So, quote, "Even after the Chinese communists took power, it was the erroneous understanding of class as something related only to the relations of production, not the total relations and dialectics occurring in society, that would manifest in various revisionist thinking backing the policies enacted even within Mao's lifetime. The same case can be found in the Soviet Union, where the notion of class had vestiges of being solved by politico-legal means and the development of the means of production, which would cause the CPSUB to believe that the USSR had reached classlessness by 1936. That's Communist Party of the
Union Bolsheviks,
Communist Party of the Soviet Union Bolsheviks, right? To believe that the USSR had reached classlessness by 1936. They misunderstood that class is concretely made by humans, but has an abstract but total existence in how it remains in various praxes surrounding even the quote-unquote logic of institutions and machines. Classlessness could not be achieved simply by enacting laws on property rights, improving the machinery, or even educational discussions. Every human activity and way of thinking would have to be re-examined and sublated through various struggles in all these fields." I mean, I really appreciated this passage. That's the end of it. So talk a little bit about this. Particularly, I'm interested in kind of what you're thinking about in terms of re-examining or sublating every human activity through various struggles. I know you're not going to be able to offer a totally prescriptive answer to how a process like that should occur, but do you have specific examples of areas where a process like this has occurred in history, not necessarily in total, obviously, right? Because we haven't seen that total transition to a classless society. Maybe an example of how that happened within a specific field, or like what a struggle like that might start to look like, or examples of how, on the other side, a failure to engage in that kind of struggle stifles revolutionary processes.
All right. Ooh, that's a lot to unpack there, man. I think that I do understand, though, is that I'll answer that from first, like, I guess clarifying some theoretical positions and then going to answering the questions or the question-specific examples. But, like, theoretically, I do highlight that inevitably the notion of a class position is definitely related to the relations of production. But the notion of class, like, this is a thing that does not just mean relations of production in a more, not discrete sense, but in a more surface level understanding of relations as, jobs, employment status, etc., etc. But as I said, right, like, even things that, even praxis, which are not about that determines your class, like, i.e., your race, gender, etc., your religion, they become articulated, or class articulated rather. So even those praxis need to be subjected to the class struggle, right? So with that, essentially, to me, it's the answer is really class struggle towards the emancipation of all humans. And I guess it just probably reiterates a general Marxist goal point, I guess, where it's like you've technically created all the conditions necessary for humans to do all kinds of activities and to engage all their physical and mental capacities, right? Without impeding on the capacities of others. It's quite, Marxist, it's quite Hegelian, it's quite Spinoza, but really just, outright there. But how should that kind of process happen? That, I believe, is a question of politics, political skill. Because, like, you would answer this in a blanket way and say, that's kind of what they try to do with the 1,000 flowers, 100 schools of thought content kind of campaign, or like a cultural revolution kind of thing, where you criticize everything, right? Etc., etc. But more than that, I think the way, and also as a way of critiquing some of the shortcomings of the great proletarian cultural revolution in China, is really putting politics in command. For what are we criticizing, and for what are we changing the direction of this praxis's development? And this is not something that I believe, as you mentioned, we're not there yet, totality, but it is actually being done. I'd like to raise, like, my understanding of two certain cases from a revolutionary perspective. That being gay marriage in the revolutionary movement in the Philippines and organizing of churches. Because, like, typical, right, you'd see this as a stereotype of the left, especially of Marxist-Leninist, that tradition of the left, that at a certain point in time, homosexuality was still under the category of bourgeois decadence, right? And you would kind of understand why, because, again, it's a question of class articulations where typical depictions, representations, and spaces where homosexuality, was more prominent were generally considered, to be among the bourgeois class. But being homosexual or being not straight is not indicatory of being a bourgeois, right? That makes so much sense to us now. Right. But you understand that it was through the development of the struggles, right, from the 70s onwards of the LGBT movement, where they saw the militants of the LGBT community to actually go with the workers. And in the Philippines, right, so as far as I know, the Communist Party, because it does have its own, the National Democratic Forces in the underground revolutionary movement do have the ability to officiate their own weddings because they have their own people's government in certain consolidated areas that, weddings are officiated. And then you really ask yourself, it really looks weird, right? In a Catholic country that's been colonized by the Spaniards and the Americans, right? And the leading revolutionary organization is Marxist-Leninist Maoist. So coming from that same Leninist Stalin tradition of, homosexuals are deviants, etc. It's so weird. How would gay marriage even emerge? And yet, not only are they being wedded, but there's really actual relationships being fostered there. That's, even adhering to military regulation. It's really amazing. And how they were able to do that, for what I understand, it was struggle on both a lived and political ideological level, in the sense that I've heard a story about the first couple who got married, that they were gay. I mean, I believe one of them was of petty bourgeois origin. Like, they were an organizer in the cities. And then they had lived in with their soon-to-be, couple. And they were also engaged. I'm not so sure entirely in the story, but for those things, they got, disciplinary action. It wasn't a smooth process. Like, they had the DA for that kind of thing. But eventually, these comrades persisted and had put politics in command. And then they start to realize, they, as in the couple and the comrades around them, that it's not the homosexuality that is the primary culprit in decadent behavior. It still goes back to class. And thus they realize that if we allow, we program, the Communist Party does that. Like, it has programs for relationships. So to avoid anarchism in relationships and to foster the well-being of people inside the relationship, their logic is, I understand it. Like, if you see a sizable amount of people from a minority who've been so, misrepresented as deviants and degenerates, and you see that they persist in the revolution, even if you're not comfy with it because of those preconceived notions, you see at the end of the day their political worth and their sincerity in the struggle. And thus, the re-examination, as I said, happens. And then you realize, if we can allow people to get wed in the people's government as straight couples, why shouldn't we not extend that to the LGBT community? And thus you realize, this struggle is not simply something like a grand Twitter war, where it's like, oh, my theory of explaining it is better than yours. The end of the day, the proof is in the eating of the pudding. So you prove the legitimacy and disprove the erroneous views on a certain praxis by actually doing by actually revolutionizing the praxis itself of being not straight in the movement. And I guess the second example is the church. As again, you would really not expect a country that's been, one of its primary concerns during Spanish colonialism is, the friars taking all the land. So their friars are definitely, the church was a class enemy. And yet they were one of the first institutions who had people to articulate national liberation. But even beyond that, right? Even beyond that national liberation, the fact that a Marxist, a communist, could even work with the church on a political, strategic level it's mind-boggling for someone who looks at the history of the Soviet Union, right, on Lenin's notions of militant atheism, and none of that is denied by the Communist Party. Like, it's pretty clear if you read, like, John Wassison's writings on religion, that the church is really an ideological weapon of the reactionary elite. And yet, right, by going down into the politics of it, being that you see the intersections of the demands of the church or its teachings and how it intersects with a communist demands in the certain specific conditions of the Philippines, that these forces can actually align and work, right, with each other. And so you will not be surprised why there would be figures like Louis Halandoni, who was a priest, right? Who wasn't, his story being I believe he was a drunkard and like he was like really peak landlord decadent youth in one of the big popular private schools in this country. And then he became a priest because I believe he almost got it on accident and nearly died. So you get that part, right? Like, he nearly died, tried to change. And then in his priesthood, he goes into ministering to the people in his home province, whom he is a landowner of. And in the process of struggle, he gets red tagged, and eventually he realizes he has more in common with these communists than these Christians who claim to be, doing the Lord's work. And now what is he? I believe he's the chairman of the National Democratic Front, representing peace treaties and all that. It's really amazing if you think about these dialectical ironies, that this is not something that you can force. I think this is something that will really happen, and that certain people, certain groups of people are really bound to be the ones to do a revolutionizing through politics of the things that they're engaged with, whether it's art, whether it's their gender, whether it's their race, their religion. And again, I guess on the topic of religion, it's really no wonder why liberation theology emerges in Latin America, right? Because somewhat similar conditions make the existence of it possible. So to me, that, I guess it is a really good place to end that, because like, that really just goes to show what Marx has been telling us. It's a quote that I like rephrasing or like just paraphrasing, but I really love that notion where he says, whenever you're confronted with a problem, it really just means the material conditions for the solution already exist. So if there is a problem, if we are confronted with so many problems, and I dare say I echo sentiments among certain revolutionary groups that we are almost mirroring the conditions that Lenin was facing 100 years ago, with so many ideological positions on how to forward the revolution, right? In a period of imperialist war brimming, and in the period of just repeated economic crises and like organizations trying to band together and then splitting over the most, nonsensical things. And you realize all of these problems exist precisely because the conditions for them to be solved already exist. And it really brings us hope. It brings me hope that really just means that the fact I can even perceive that theoretical position on class, I'm not saying anything new. If anything, I think I'm just trying to like dusty up what Marx was really trying to say in the first place and what everybody tried to get wrong. But I really think that it does make sense, because like in the process of the dialectic, right, in the negation of the negation, especially if you're a materialist, you would realize everyone has a right idea. They're just quite wrong in some aspect of why it's wrong or why it's right. And so I believe there is this necessity not only to investigate in terms of the gather field evidence, but if you are specifically interested in theoretical work, it's really to what I would say to do what Marx did to Hegel and find that rational kernel in everything that we've kind of misunderstood or have just, discarded as mere, trash. Because maybe for what we needed to get to the point before us, it is trash, right? And you see that now in the sense that it was really I didn't reach it, but like millennials, like or older millennials have reached the point where it was really in to not be Marxist, but generally rebellious, right?
Yep.
Right. And now I encountered a 9-year-old who showed to me that his favorite battle is Stalingrad, and he thinks the Red Army is the greatest. And I think this kid may not understand what he's saying now, but that's really interesting how the dialectic goes throughout history. I think the same thing will happen through all of these, especially in terms of class, which is why I did say that classishness is not simply about that part which determines your class relations, right? Or your class alignment. The struggle towards classlessness is really to revolutionize all praxis. This is why I understand why Mao was so insistent in saying that even in socialist revolution, it is pure revisionism and distortion of what Marx wanted, to simply say that communism equals no more state and we have 10,000 more tractors than we used to. It's not about the machines, but like even the machine design, right? The machine design is based on capitalist logic to make efficient harvest of one root crop or one crop, when in non-commodity based agriculture, you should be planting many crops in the same plot of land or in a terrace of mountain ranges. You see, like, it's not just wantonly to grab the technology and not criticize it, or to just say, oh, you can't own any more of this, and it's classless. It's not that. It's to actually challenge and revolutionize all activity, the way it's taught and the way it's done, the materials used in it, and the conditions for it, right? Because that is what entails what communists have been saying about liberation on, removing divide of urban and rural, mental and manual labor, etc., etc. It's a total redesign of human activity and thought, and thus it becomes the revolution of relations of humans to the world and to themselves. So you get it? It's like, it's not a dogmatic notion of, oh, just change the relations of production. You won't get to change the relationship of production unless you carry forward the politicizing of all human activity. Because I always say, with relation to arts and literature and these seemingly, these class articulated things, it's like people keep saying that everything is political. That is true, right? But the question is no longer recognizing that everything is political. The question is, who is politicizing it and what is it used for? In the same way, art or any propaganda piece can be used to alter your perception of your reality, guns also do that. But the question is not, what does the gun do? Does the gun change how you fear for your life? The question is, who is holding the guns? Who is holding the ink? And how are they using it to make this world a better place? Right?
Yeah.
So that is essentially what I was trying to say. But that's what it means to struggle towards classlessness. Like, it's totally the redesign, re-examination through actual political work of all human thought and activity. And it's such a wonderful thing that we could even perceive such a project. Let alone do our part to liberate our countries somehow, or stop our countries from oppressing others, right? To actually get to somewhere nearer to that position. There, that's how I'd sum that part. Yeah.
That's a great way to end. And I'd just say that comment, the last one, of guns and so on, and these tools, that it reminded me, we interviewed Ruth Wilson Gilmore at one point and asked her about, she has this commentary on Audre Lorde, right? And Audre Lorde has this phrase that people repeat all the time: the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house, right? And
right.
she's like, the important part of that statement to me is the apostrophe. They're the master's tools, right? So
right.
if the master owns the tools, then no, they don't help us.
Right.
But if we own the tools, then then we can use them, right? And so she was used, and then she gave the example, I think, of during slave revolts, right? Of like, nobody would say that a slave picking up a gun or a sword or a knife or something like that, they couldn't use it against their master, right? I know you're making a different point too, because about also like how some of these tools are, what they're designed for, which I think is an important one as well. But yeah, this also that question of, it's not always the problem of the tool and who created the tool, but who actually owns the tool.
Right.
Yeah. All right, Dani, this has been wonderful. I really, truly enjoyed this conversation all the way through. Please keep us posted on, your work or anything. If there's stuff that happens where you're like, hey, I want to come on and have a conversation about this, things in the Philippines, you want to talk about things internationally, would love to host you again anytime.
All right, sure, man. I don't have some stuff I'm trying to work on, so probably heads up. Or you could, if FLP releases something, I'll be grateful.
Right on. Yeah. And I should say again for folks that this conversation that we've had has been based on a piece that you wrote on social investigation and class analysis in issue 1 of Material, which people can purchase on the Foreign Languages Press website. We'll, of course, include that in the show description. And I believe they also have a PDF version of it, I think, available now. If
on the webpage also, I think.
Yeah. So people can also read it there. But I do encourage people to support Foreign Languages Press because they do a great job of printing a whole bunch of really great Marxist literature, Maoist literature, and I'm very appreciative of the work that they do and your contribution in it.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.